Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Well, Kate taught English at SUNY Albany for 28 years, you said? And she currently lives in Altamont in Hawaii. That's quite the contrast. If you know the book Roughing It by Mark Twain, it's an absolutely laugh-out-loud, funny book. You know that the last maybe 1/5 or 1/6 of the book is when Mark Twain was in Hawaii. His famous letters from Hawaii were also published separately. So Kate has written a novel speculating, I guess, on, I'm sorry, well, the other thing was, there's a 6-week period when he was in Hawaii. I guess people don't know what he was up to. So Kate has written a novel called Lost Twain, speculating on what he may have done, but it goes back and forth in time. I haven't read it yet. Okay. So she's going to tell us about the book. So here's Kate Winter.
Oh. Thank you. That's just like in Hawaii. People applaud before you dance a hula or sing a song, and I think it's just very hopeful. Can y'all see me and hear me? Okay, good. I am not a person who likes to work behind a podium, so I may have to wander. Is that all right? Okay. I started this book, Lost Twain, which is what it looks like. I started this book 7 years ago, and it got started right here in Albany. I was having coffee with a writer friend of mine named Bob Miner. Some of you might know him. He's from Saratoga Springs. And I was whining a little that I really wanted to write about Mark Twain in Hawaii, but that there wasn't enough fact to really build a whole book about. And other people had sort of tried to do it in a scholarly way and had failed. And so he looked at me and said, well, then what you have to do is lie. Now, I don't know why that never occurred to me before, but I decided I would lie. And so he and I sat there, and in about 20 minutes, we sketched out what a novel might look like. And this one doesn't look anything like that now that it's finished, but that was what got me started. So it started in the student union at SUNY Albany when I was still teaching there. And what interested me particularly was that when a person goes to Hawaii, they tend to have one of two reactions. Either they fall in love with it and they want to go back and back and back, or they come away very jaded and they realize that it's nothing like the beaches and palm trees and the advertising. That there's a whole other complex life going on under those postcard images. And they don't like it and they leave. And that's fine, they should leave. But when I left the university at Albany after 28 years, I decided I was going to try to live in Hawaii. And that had been a place that my husband and I always thought we would retire to. And so I decided I would just go. And I hardly ever come back, right? I come back here for the summers because the summers used to be beautiful here in upstate New York. They used to be cool and green and not like this. But in any case, I decided after I talked with my friend about what this would look like as a novel, that it really needed to have a contemporary American character to tell the story of finding this lost journal that Mark Twain wrote. Now, if you know much about Mark Twain, you probably know that he kept a journal all the time. He was writing down meals that he had, people he met, little snippets of conversation. He was just constantly keeping notes on his day with a pencil and in a leather journal. All of those journals are in libraries in various places around the world. And so people have access to them. And biographers and scholars of Mark Twain can date everything he was doing up to a certain point, almost literally day by day. Some of it's quite boring, but some of it's very juicy. But then there's this period of 6 weeks when he was in Hawaii as a reporter for the Sacramento Union newspaper, and he disappeared. We know where he was on one day, and then the next day, nothing. So I thought, well, if I could construct in my head the the notes that he would have taken during that time, then I could tell the story of what I think he was doing, because I think I know Mark Twain pretty well. He does visit occasionally. I'll just tell you that. The family thinks the house is haunted by Mark Twain. So in any case, it was very important to have a narrator who was grounded in reality, as well as Mark Twain, who was grounded in a different reality that was partly fictional. So I created this, it's a big stretch. I created a narrator who is an American literature teacher at a university, Buffalo, actually. I didn't have the nerve to say that she taught at SUNY Albany, so I put her at Buffalo. And her name is Emily Witt, and she's just gotten tenure at the University at Buffalo and in the English department, and is full of that letdown that you get when you get tenure, because that's all you've worked for 12 years. You've tried to get tenure, and then you get it and you think, oh my gosh, I have to be here for the rest of my life. I can never go anywhere else. And so in that state, she goes to Hawaii to track down a story about Herman Melville, who's a much more respected writer than Mark Twain in some circles. And while she's there, she meets a very mysterious Hawaiian. And he's mysterious in a lot of ways. For one thing, he has hazel-colored eyes instead of dark brown eyes. And he speaks very good English. And he does a lot of freelance work. He dances hula, he teaches Hawaiian language. He doesn't seem to be rooted in a tenured position anywhere. So he's quite interesting to her. And she spends 2 different periods of time with him and decides that he's interesting to her as a specimen, not as a man. But I'm here to tell you that changes over the course of the book. You know, you got to have a romance. And so on the second day that she encounters him and spends time with him, he gives her a package, and this package is wrapped in Hawaiian kapa cloth, which is a kind of beaten bark cloth that they use in Hawaii that's very, very special and rarely made anymore except by Hawaiian artisans. And so that she unwraps this thing, and inside is a leather-bound book with gold around the edges of the pages, and it's handwritten in pencil. And she begins to read it, and after a while, she figures out that this is the lost journal of Mark Twain. And so she now knows what he did for the 6 weeks that he was lost in Hawaii. By the way, he was also lost on the island of Maui. So that, if you've ever been to Maui, how many people have been to Hawaii, by the way? Okay, so the island of Maui is kind of its own place, and I spent a lot of time over there trying to absorb how it was different from where I live in Hawaii. And it's easy to understand how he could get lost there. So basically there are 2 voices, and so there are 2 different time periods in this novel. The first is when Dr. Emily Witt, Professor Emily Witt, goes to Maui in search of information and comes up with this strange lost journal that she doesn't really know what to do with. And the second voice is right out of the journal. It's Twain's voice. And I thought, rather than read her voice, because if you're listening to me, you have some idea how she might sound. I admit that. I thought I would read a couple of the pieces that are pulled out of the journal, so that you could sort of hear how Mark Twain's voice is in here. And I decided just for fun, I'd read you the very first part of the journal that Emily Witt reads. And so I want you to imagine now I have long white hair and I'm wearing a white suit and smoking a cigar. But I understand there's no cigar smoking in here, so I didn't bring one. Oh, I have to take this with me. So this is April 14th, 1866. And this is right after Mark Twain has run away from the Civil War and been hanging out in California, which was a frontier at that time, and then has accepted this job in Hawaii, sending back dispatches about the politics and the economy, because American businessmen were very interested in Hawaii. Hawaii had sugar, and they wanted to be able to buy sugar in Hawaii and not have to compete with the beet sugar and the sugar cane that was no longer available from the South in America because of the Civil War. So they were interested in politics, and boy, was Mark Twain interested in politics as well. So this is the first entry in the Lost Journal. Strong coffee and opinions from the Reverend this morning about my being out late with Miss M of Ulupalakua Ranch in Maui. Rode to Kihei and back, returning late in the evening. She and her pretty sister are fine horsewomen, for Kama'aina girls reared up on these mares, but never will compare to the native women on horseback. Right away, Twain is starting to compare the things that he encounters in Hawaii with the things that he has familiarity with back both in the East and in California. Ulupalakua means something about ripening breadfruit, but the place is also famous as Rose Ranch for its lavish gardens and hospitality, all manner of high-toned visitors, ambassadors, explorers, royalty, even authors. A fine frame for the allure of those owners' daughters. Both are good-looking girls, simply and modestly clad, even in Hawaii's heat, accomplished, heirs to a plantation that yields a respectable $60,000 annual. Either of the young ladies would make a likely wife, intelligent, well-bred, child of a respectable family, and spotless in reputation, despite riding out with me. This morning's conversation turned to marriage and Miss M's inevitable descent to it. I assured the Reverend that I'm an unlikely prospect with no clothes and less money. She's after a man with more than a slight reputation as a newspaper man to recommend him. Still, had I been more enterprising and blessed with a bit of capital, I'd have had a chance to marry the girl and the plantation and live in upcountry comfort where the whiskey is always top shelf. So you sort of get the sense at the very opening that he's very materialistic, and he's of an age, he's 30 years old, he's of an age when he needs to be thinking about settling down with a woman. He's had lots of experience with other women. And so he's, you know, sort of scouting out the situation.
Has he written any books at this point?
No, stories and newspaper articles. He had just published, before he left for Hawaii, Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. And so he was beginning to see that maybe that was going to be more fun than journalism, even.
Tales of the Mississippi came later?
Later, So he's now at the home of a minister on Maui, and that's usually what happened. He was put up in a local minister's home or one of the white merchants in Hawaii or something like that. They didn't have a lot of hotels in Hawaii at that time, in 1866. And so the morning has come, and he's expecting an Hawaiian person to come and meet him and take him by horseback to the next place that he's going to on Maui, where he'll spend 2 days, and then he'll take the steamer back. And so he's chatting and anticipating that this young man will arrive and take him on his journey. And he says, having concluded my study of the sugar plantations and Miss M, I was ready to move on. Mr. K threw open the door and commenced his breakfast sermon just then, and the morning fell in. I was to begin the journey to Hana today with some rambunctious youth the Reverend Mr. K had engaged, but now there stood in front of us a woman, youngish, of that better class of Kanaka. Kanaka is a Hawaiian word that the Haole, the non-Hawaiian people who settled Hawaii, used to define and describe local people of the better class, not the really low class common people, but the people who had education and money. She waited for me, probably. I am here for Mr. C, confirmed it. Mr. K inquired what had happened to her brother and learned that he'd broken a leg the day before. Though I couldn't make out precisely how that had happened, it seemed to involve a horse, one of those sway-back, headstrong, and spine-weak mounts that natives prize. When the consultation before me ended, he turned to me and reassured me that this woman would do as a guide to my next accommodation. Surely you don't expect me to go off with her. She's hardly, I protested somewhat feebly, but she was not, I saw, as young as I had supposed her to be. Owing to the smoothness of her skin, her diminutive stature, and the lithe grace of her body, even inside that calico tent that the missionaries had legislated she wear, I underestimated her by perhaps a decade. Mr. K responded, "The native women ride as well as the men. Just follow her and try to do what she tells you." I looked at her gingerbread skin, those black eyes, an extravagant cascade of dark hair, a perfect island beauty, and reconsidered. She speaks English? Of course. Educated at the mission school in Lahaina, knows the Bible as well as most missionaries. I should have known better than to book a tour with a deacon. She won't preach at me, will she? He didn't answer me directly. Napua, my host said with undisguised disdain, for myself. Her name, I suppose he meant. It was then she raised her eyes to me, and though I mistrusted it, I gave myself into her hands. The horse she'd brought was the capricious sort of nag I learned to loathe in my adventures on Oahu. It jerked the reins and launched left and then right as I approached it. The woman gathered its head in her hands and whispered some Kanaka secret into its muzzle, whereupon it settled into a comfortable stance for me. Having accomplished the saddle, I was bumped about some, but felt secure that with such an able horsewoman in front of me, she never stopped to look at me, though, without laughing, hiding her mouth behind her hand. Why? To spare my feelings? So they're off. He's now traveling cross-country on horseback with this Hawaiian woman, young Hawaiian woman, not what he anticipated. And they're going to have adventures. One of them is, as they go around the western side of Maui, they go around the slope of the volcano Haleakala. And in doing that, they have to cross what is now a road with 57 bridges. Yeah, it's like this. And there was just basically a horse trail in 1866. And so they would have to go across and go down and then back up. And at one point, they have a terrible adventure where they begin to go down the slope into one of the gullies, and there's a sudden rainstorm, And just like happens here, I've heard, water comes rushing down the gully, and they're almost killed, almost washed out to sea, horses and everything. And the only thing he loses is his watch and 1 bottle of whiskey, but he does save his cigars. This is important. He hangs on to his cigars. And she saves his life. But now they're stopped by this storm. They can't go anywhere. So she leads him to a little place that she embellishes with palm fronds and so forth to keep the water out. And they have camp. And they stay camped for a while. I'm not going to say too much more about that because some of it's, R-rated. But this, by the way, is a book. My brother, my elder brother, is also from the Albany area, and he's a minister, and he tells everyone that this is his sister's dirty book. So, and I don't pay him to do that. I really don't. But I'm looking for another short piece to read to you. Here we go. You know, Mark Twain really liked tall tales, right? And so he was like lots of people who tell tall tales, me included. They may have a little bit of truth in them, but they're much more charming when they've been embellished and, as my mother says, embroidered. So he's pretty loose with fact, except when he's writing for the newspaper. But in general, the things he says are rather exaggerated. Well, he gets into a situation with Napua, this wonderful young woman, and he has to hide, and she has to try to hide him from this person who is this sort of like a Brinks detective who's trying to follow them and find him, and because his newspaper wants to know where the heck he is. And so she ends up, Napua, the Hawaiian woman, telling this fairly elaborate lie to this man in the brown hat so that he will go in an opposite direction and not continue to pursue Sam Clemens. And the thing I found fun about this was a fun part to write, was that I could imagine, because I know lots of Hawaiians and I know how little they talk, and when they do talk, they say absolute truth. And the reason is that they believe that once a word is spoken, it becomes reality. So you would never say, oh, to your child, oh, be quiet or the boogeyman will get you. Because that would actually create a boogeyman. So lying for Napua is a very big deal. And this is what Mark Twain had to say about it. Napua has gone off alone, bearing offerings to make amends to her personal gods, her Aumakua, the spirit ancestors who watch over her, and her Ohana, her family particularly. 2 days ago, we heard an owl nearby. She waited most of the morning until it swooped just inches from her shoulder. She says it is Pueo, the transformed spirit of one of her foremothers. She says it protects her in the forest and brings messages and advice and warnings. Maybe so. Out here, beyond the reigns of her Christian companion, she reverts to ancient ways more and oftener. She wears her Christianity like the calico over her paganism, doffing it when there is necessity and leaving it off when there is any immediate danger, such as today's alarm. I cannot help but worship a woman so utterly free of guile. It was, I suppose, her very first lie. Having been raised a Christian, I know the delight of forbidden fruits and enjoy a good bit of prevarication now and again. I can lie like a senator, to tell the truth. But for Napua, there was no delight even in the novelty of it. Only the sorrow of transgression and fear that the lie she had spoken would become an awful truth. Basically, what she did is tell this pursuer that the person who was hidden in the house was her father, and that he had leprosy, and so he should just move on and he should go in the opposite direction. So now, of course, Napua is afraid that her father really will contract leprosy. Such is the power of the word for her, that she has lied for me seems to put a certain responsibility on me. A yoke not altogether uncomfortable or unwelcome, though I wear it as an indictment of my own proclivity for exaggeration, prevarication, and embroidering the truth. For Napua, words are precious by virtue of their veracity and the power they contain to make things come to pass. A word unleashed has the power of ancient creation behind it, a sorcerer's strength, the curse of Merlin, beyond any calling back or cancellation. This accounts, no doubt, for the brevity and precision of their conversations. The word once spoken becomes what is, and so they are fastidious in what they say. I would rather have Napua's good opinion of my moral nature than 50 clergymen. The gospel, according to Napua, is a good deal more Christian in its heathenism than theirs in its theology. I fear I shall never be as upright as she is in her way, and a man cannot be entirely comfortable without his own approval. So he begins to test the things that he has always believed in against the reality that he finds in the daily life of Hawaiian people. And once he leaves that missionary's home, he really is exposed to an entirely different culture. And it's not until he goes back to Honolulu after the 6 weeks, and by then he has fallen completely in love with Napua and with the things that she believes in, and he has come to detest the missionaries, all of them. And he begins to see that there's a kind of exploitation going on in Hawaii that is born of American greed and American capitalism. And he begins to write about that. And that is a point at which he began to think about his book, Roughing It, which Joe mentioned at the outset, and some of his essays on Christian religion, which were very provocative for the time and continue to be today. So when I talk about this book at book groups and so forth, very often what people ask me, and I hope you have some good questions for me, but very often what people ask me is, well, if he found it to be so different from America, why did he leave? If he wanted to be there in that culture and in that climate, he talks about, in his journals, he talks about, after he's been there, he talks about how they always, in Hawaii, wear summer because their clothing is always lightweight and flowing and comfortable and loose-collared. And he just rhapsodizes about that lifestyle. Not about the food, but then he never really liked food very much anyway. But why did he leave? That was the question that was the hardest for me to answer. I couldn't imagine that at 30, with a career ahead of him, he would have stayed in Hawaii for this woman, this native woman. And he did have some anxieties about if they stayed together and had children, what would those children look like? And how would they be treated in the world? Because he was very aware from his time growing up in the Central South that children of mixed race had a very difficult row to hoe. He also had discovered, though, that in Hawaii, all children are considered golden. It makes no difference, and they belong to everybody. The Hawaiians love children more than anything. It's better than money to have many children. And so people reproduce at an alarming rate. And they have children with lots of different races so that it's all a nice mix, you know. Mark Twain wasn't there yet. He just couldn't imagine that. And so I had to come up with some kind of a reason that he'd leave after his love affair and his passion for the islands. And guess what it was? Anybody have an idea? You read the book. Don't remember it, I bet. Nobody ever does, because nobody believes that he would really leave and come back to America. So I think I did my job. I'm happy. You have to just get the book out of the library and read it to find out why he finally does leave Hawaii. But he does. He goes to Honolulu. And all of this is based on fact up to the beginning of that 6-week period and the ending of that 6-week period. And at the end of that time, he wrote a letter to his sister while he was on the steamer between Maui and Honolulu. He wrote a letter to his sister and said to her, "I have been lost on Maui for 6 weeks, and I have not written a word, nor would I have wasted a moment of that precious time." So we know that something he was doing in those 6 weeks was very powerful for him, because that's all he ever said about it in all of his work. That's more than a postcard home. That's a real admission, I think. Yes? He did go back. He went back in, that's a great question, thank you. He went back in, it's actually in the epilogue to the book, in 88, I think, 1888. I'm sorry, 1895. And he was desperate for money. By then he was married to Olivia Langdon and had a family and lots of expenses. And he had accepted a world tour, and he was sailing around the world to give lectures. You know, he was a great one for standing up at a podium and talking and telling stories and jokes and things. And that actually is how he made a lot of his money. And so he was going to do that. And when he left the West Coast on a steamer, his plan was that he would get to Honolulu, he'd get off at Honolulu and sail to Maui, and then he would have some time exploring and revisiting all of that joy that he had in his life. When they pulled into Honolulu Harbor, pilot boat came out and announced that no one could go ashore because there was cholera in Honolulu City. And he could not go, nobody could go ashore unless they were passengers who had only booked as far as Honolulu, and then they had to go ashore. And so I end the book with him standing at the rail of the steamer, looking at Honolulu and knowing he'll never go back, because by then he was too old to imagine that he would ever come around that way again. And so he never got back there, ever. Sad, yeah? Any other questions? I would love to just talk with you and instead of lecturing you. Joe?
Mark Twain shows up a lot in fiction, in mysteries, and a book like yours, even in science fiction.
Yep.
Why do you think he makes such a great, well, he was a real person, obviously, but he makes such a great fictional character, too?
That's a wonderful question. And I think that the answer is that his voice is so particular to him. I mean, if you hear a few lines, you can sort of begin to oh, that's probably Mark Twain, which is why if you read quotations on the internet or anything, people are always attributing short, pithy remarks to Mark Twain, even though lots of times they're by Oscar Wilde or some other writer. But I think that's it. His voice is so unique, and he's so sarcastic and sardonic. So I think that's why he keeps showing up, because he's a good time.
Well, of course, his autobiography was a big bestseller 2 years ago.
I know.
Part 2 is coming out this fall.
I know.
Did that surprise you that his autobiography in the year 2010 would be the best?
Actually, it didn't surprise me. The autobiography itself surprised me. By the time he wrote that, and he left it with instructions that it couldn't be published for 100 years after his death. So he was protecting himself and his family and the people he wrote about. it needs a good edit because he wasn't in control of his material the way he is normally or was normally. And so he sort of is all over the place. And I think it's very sad because we see the creative mind at work, but we don't see the creative writer pulling it together and framing things. And so I'm betting that the second volume won't sell as well as the first volume did. There are lots of Twainiacs out there. Lots of people who adore him. Any other questions about that? And then I'll tell you another thing.
Just one thing. In the beginning, you said April 14, 1866. And I think that's the first anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. Did that?
Is it really?
I think it is. It's either the 12th or the 14th. I was just wondering if that was.
I never put that together.
Could you repeat what?
Oh, the question was, April 14th is the anniversary of 1865 is the anniversary 66, the anniversary of Lincoln's assassination, and she's wondering, did that have anything to do with his first entry? I didn't even think about that connection when I was writing the book. What I did was I had made a timeline of all the dates and where he was, and we knew where he was at particular times. And I put that 2 days after the last dinner that we know that he had at the ranch, at Ulupalakua Ranch with one of the princes of Hawaii. And then I gave him 2 days to, I don't know, sleep it off or something. But that's I wish I'd thought of that myself. Thank you, that's a wonderful question. I'll put that in the next edition or something. Any other questions?
Not
Arlene.
a question so much as an observation. I think Twain was always unsettled in his thinking about the golden age and the wonderful life that there was, and that he was actually living, which essentially put him in debt.
Yes.
But he always seemed to have this very unsettled mind about, was this okay or wasn't it? But it didn't stop him from living the lifestyle.
No, it didn't. And I honestly think from looking at him as a young man, he would not have lived that lifestyle if he hadn't come back to the U.S. and married Olivia Langdon, because marrying into the Langdon family immediately created some expectations. And his father-in-law, Olivia's father, gave them a house in Buffalo and introduced them to society and made sure that Olivia had nice clothes and all that. I mean, he talks in the book about marrying well when he's in Hawaii. He's thinking about it. And he married very well back here. So I think that was always a little bit alien to him, but he participated in it willingly. That doesn't mean he didn't feel guilty or uncomfortable. You know, and he was the same way about his writing. He says that comedy is that lower form of literature, and that it is water and literature is wine. And so, although he wrote comedy, and that's what he did to make a very comfortable living if he hadn't spent his money so badly, I think he always felt that he was just kind of, he was an outsider, but he was still participating as best he might. Yeah. And actually, Emily Witt, the scholar who finds the journal or is given the journal, she has a lot of that same anguish. And so in organizing the book, I tried to put sequences, because it goes back and forth between her story and Mark Twain's. I tried to do the sequence so that she would be experiencing something about Hawaii, about her position in the world, about being a teacher, and so forth. And then in the next excerpt from Twain, there would be a parallel emotional issue going on. Because I just think human beings are a lot like that. I think a lot of us live feeling like we haven't maybe earned all that we have, and maybe somebody's going to find out that we're really not as good as they might think we are. And You know, they kind of hide. Yes, sir.
Mark Twain expressed emotions about slavery, Jim Crow, or the Christian church.
Oh, a lot about the Christian church, yes. He disapproved. Well, that's a great question, by the way, because in his private writing, he blasts the missionaries for the way, all around the world, for the way they contain and then eradicate the local belief systems and the local economy. He's the one, Mark Twain is the one who started this saying in Hawaii that the missionaries came to Hawaii to do good, and instead they did well. Damned well. That's right. And so in his private writings, he talks about in his public writings, he talks about what good they did in teaching the natives to have a written language, to read and to write and to do numbers. Because none of that, the Hawaiian language was entirely oral when the missionaries got there. And they created a written language and all that. So he is of two minds. Publicly, he wants to say Western culture did a good thing. Privately, he saw the abuses and the exploitation, and he says some very nasty things about missionaries, particularly American missionaries. Now, the first part of your question was about slavery. Of course, he has lots of little rants on brown skin color. Because that's what he's surrounded by. And as he goes deeper and deeper into Maui, he sees fewer and fewer pale-skinned people. And so he begins to remember that as a boy, he had really loved a couple of slaves, that he had had two family slaves, men, who were very nurturing to him, who he spent a lot of time with, and they told him stories and taught him how to do things. And he really began to get back in touch with that and to think, maybe there isn't really that much to do about skin color, because there are good people inside all colored skin. So he stayed more away from the politics of race and was more engaged with the morality of race and how to integrate a life so that you respected the other, the person of Asian or African American or whatever descent. So again, he was kind of split, like lots of people are. That's a great question. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay.
How many books have you written?
3 that are out, and 1 that I have drafted. I have about 230 pages done. And it's about missionaries in Hawaii. It's about a missionary from Canandaigua, New York. Again, it's sort of based in old newspaper articles and things, and I'm a churchgoer, and I still see things that get done to the Hawaiian people by churches that bother me, but we do our best.
You know that book by Sarah Vowell, Unfamiliar Fishes? Would you do?
Oh, absolutely. That should be the next one everybody reads. Sarah Vowell, Unfamiliar Fishes. It's a brilliant book about Hawaiian culture and now, current times.
What is the title?
Unfamiliar Fishes. It's brilliant.
I haven't been in Hawaii in years, so you've been there recently, you know better than I. But when I was there 40 years ago, a lot of the big companies, the names of the big companies, if you trace them back, they were American missionaries.
Absolutely.
And they were missionaries for maybe the first generation, possibly the second generation, and after that, they went into business.
That's right, and they did very well because they had.
They were still there.
And they are still there today. Castle and Cook is still there, raking it in. And they were also the missionaries were plugged in very closely to the monarchy. So until the monarchy was overthrown in 1896, the missionaries had this ready access to land and other resources, and they continued to acquire wealth. They often married Hawaiian royalty. So they got the royal lands, the crown lands, as well as whatever they could acquire through business. They were they were New Englanders. They knew how to pinch a penny until it squealed. They were wonderful at it. And they still own tons. Bishop. Yep. Now, Bishop Estates even is a little more complicated even because Princess Pauahi Bishop is the Hawaiian side of that family, and the Cleghorn family is the New England side of that family. And so they really blended Hawaiian business, ranching, as well as all of the mercantilism and provisioning ships and all that sort of stuff. So they did very well. But one of the things that's very interesting about contemporary Hawaii, interesting to me, is that about 40% of the land is owned in perpetuity by the royal family. They're crown lands. They may be under the control of the Bishop Estate, for example, or the Liliuokalani Estate Trust, but they still maintain Hawaiianness, even though they make money. And this is one of my favorite things to say about the Big Island, where I live and love. They just, Kamehameha Trust had a hotel complex down on the ocean front in the town where I live, Kailua. And the hotel was failing. The tourism has really shifted. We're not making any money on tourists right now. And we haven't been since the economy tanked. And so they knew they had to close the hotel. And what they decided to do was to take it all down, take out all of the accessories to the hotel, and turn it into a people's park. And it's going to be a people's park that is full of Hawaiian cultural sites and will be staffed by museum docents all day, and will be available to the public to see and learn about Hawaiian fishing, Hawaiian canoe making, Hawaiian tapa making, all of those kinds of things. And this is in Kailua Kona, on the Big Island of Hawaii, on the western shore. And it's very exciting that there's this kind of resurgence, and it's partly because that was the Kamehameha Investment Corporation. And they're beginning to hearken back to their roots and say, maybe we don't really need to build another hotel or golf course. Maybe we got enough. That's good. Hiram.
When I was there, if you wanted to buy a house, you could buy a house, but you couldn't buy the land.
That's right.
Still that way? You got a 99-year lease with a clause that you could renew that lease, but you couldn't buy the land.
That's right.
Still.
And you had to build on the land, and you had to maintain the land in some way. And that is still true for quite a bit of the land in Hawaii, and it's called leasehold. So you buy the lease for $100, and then you build your house on it, and you can live there, and your children can live there the whole length of the lease. And you can even sell that lease. If you want to sell your home, for example, you can sell the lease and sell the house, but the house is only worth whatever the building itself is worth. So it's very complicated. I just bought a house in Hawaii, and the land that it's on was originally crown lands. And my little eighth of an acre of it was available for sale. It was broken up and made available for sale. And so that's what, there are lots of, I would never buy leasehold. I have lots of friends who have homes on leasehold land, even farms, and
40 years ago, particularly in Hawaii.
yep. And Oahu is much more so than, because it's got Honolulu and it was the original center of the court, it has more leased land than the other islands. Our islands tended to go to ranchers, and so they had a little more private land. But it's still, I don't know the percentage, but I'm guessing it's about 35 or 40% of all home sales are on leased land, because that's what there is most of. Great questions. Comment.
You live in Big Island.
I live on the Big Island. I live at the 600-foot elevation. Bought my house 2.5 years ago. After living in 4 other places on that side, trying to figure out where I really wanted to be. Right after, within about 4 months after I bought the house and moved into it, we had a tsunami. When Fukushima tsunami, all that happened, we had a tsunami, and I was really, really glad that I didn't buy land farther down near the ocean. I can see the ocean. I can see for 11 miles along the coastline. That's fine. I'm up there. Tsunamis come down there. I'm good with that. I'm very good with that. Earthquakes we have all the time, constantly. Earthquakes all the time because it's a live volcano. Not most of them. Most of them are enough to sort of rattle the dishes and sometimes a window, but not too bad. You learn to kind of.
How far are you from that mountain that can blow up?
That one. Actually, I live right on the slope of it. But I do. But the flow pattern historically has gone around where I live. It either comes down the south side or down the north side. I put my money on history, and well, you got to have faith in something, right? So that's what I do. That's what I do. I'm very blessed because living in Hawaii, I dance hula at the Royal Palace. I have a wonderful church family. I write half a day every day. And I have a fantastic 92-year-old mother who loves Hawaii. So we're quite blessed. And I have an amazing Hawaiian husband, which I don't like to talk about too much because everybody thinks that the Hawaiian man in here is him. And he's sick of going to parties and saying, no, I never did that. And we live off the land a lot. I was telling someone the other day about how, we get free papayas off our own papaya trees, and we trade for oranges and eggs, and we fish for our own fish, and it's not the lifestyle that the advertisements tell tourists. It's a different way of living, and so if you feel like coming to Hawaii someday, come soon.
Can you still get good bananas over there?
We grow good bananas over there, great bananas, 3 varieties that are very prolific. Yep, we have our own bananas and everything. Any other questions? We're out of time, aren't we?
Well, thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for being here on a hot day like today. Thank you. Really, I appreciate you coming out.